The dust had been swirling across Steins Pass, New Mexico territory, for 2 decades, just as long as Mason Drake had been shutting out the world. The day he spotted a woman's silhouette against the crimson sunset, standing beside a broken-down wagon on the outskirts of his property, was the day 20 years of carefully constructed solitude began to crumble. It was the spring of 1885, and Mason had long since stopped counting the seasons. At 43, his weathered face told stories his lips refused to share. His ranch, perched on the rocky terrain outside of Steins Pass, was as isolated as a man could manage while still maintaining a modest cattle operation. The locals knew to leave him be, and travelers rarely ventured this far off the main trail. Margarette Holden had never planned to find herself stranded in this desolate stretch of the New Mexico territory. At 28, she had already seen more hardship than most would in a lifetime. Her hands were blistered from trying to fix the broken wagon wheel, and the setting sun meant night would soon bring the desert's bitter cold. Mason watched her through his brass spyglass, debating whether to ride down or let her figure her own way out. There had been a time when helping a lady in distress would have been second nature to him, but those days were buried alongside memories he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. "Damn fool woman," he muttered, lowering the spyglass and retrieving his rifle. His horse, a sturdy palomino named Copper, nickered softly as Mason swung into the saddle. "I know, old boy, we should mind our own business," but something about the determined way the woman was attempting to repair her wheel, a task clearly beyond her current skill, moved him to action. He guided Copper down the rocky path toward the broken wagon. As he approached, he could see her more clearly. Hair the color of burnished copper was pulled back in a practical braid, though wild tendrils had escaped to frame a face flushed with effort. Her dress was plain but well made, the kind worn by a woman with both practical sense and modest means. She straightened when she heard the approaching hoofbeats, one hand reaching for something hidden in the folds of her skirt. Mason recognized the wariness of someone who had learned the hard way that strangers weren't always kind. "Wheels broken beyond your fixing, madam," Mason said by way of greeting, stopping Copper at a respectful distance. "I'm aware of that now," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of an Eastern accent. "Though I've learned it's best to try before admitting defeat." Mason dismounted, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "You're a fair piece from the main road. What brings you out this way?" "My poor navigation skills, apparently." A wry smile touched her lips briefly before fading. "I was heading to Steins Pass. I've been offered a position as the schoolteacher there." Mason nodded, eyeing the wheel. It wasn't just broken, the entire axle was cracked. "You won't be getting this wagon anywhere tonight. Storm's coming too." He glanced at the darkening sky where clouds were gathering on the western horizon. "My ranch is just up that rise. You can shelter there for the night." Margarette stiffened visibly. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose." "It's not kindness, madam. It's common sense. Desert nights kill, and that storm will bring flash floods in these parts." He gestured to her luggage. "Take what you need for the night. I'll send one of my hands to town tomorrow for the blacksmith." Her eyes, a clear hazel that reminded him of the mountain streams of his youth, studied him with careful assessment. "And you are Mason Drake?" "Margarette Holden." She extended her hand formally, and Mason hesitated before taking it briefly in his own calloused one. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Drake." "Just Mason," he corrected, already moving to help secure her wagon. "Anyone around here will tell you I'm not one for formalities. If anyone around here would speak of you at all," she observed shrewdly. "I suspect you're not one for company either." Mason paused, his back to her as he tied down the wagon cover. You'd be right about that. The ride to the ranch was mostly silent. Mason had insisted Margarette ride Copper while he led the horse on foot. The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached the modest ranch house, forcing them to make a dash for the covered porch. The inside of Mason's home revealed a spare but well-maintained living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a worn leather chair positioned nearby. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that looked well-read. It was clean but clearly the home of someone who lived alone and saw little need for decorative touches. "It's not much," Mason said gruffly, moving to light the lamps. "It's shelter," Margarette replied simply, setting down her small traveling case. "And I'm grateful for it." As Mason built a fire, Margarette took in more details of the room. A few sketches hung on the walls, landscapes mostly, but also one of a woman with a gentle smile. She didn't ask about them. People's pasts were their own business. She of all people understood that. "Are you hungry?" Mason asked, the fire now crackling to life. "Yes, though I have some provisions in my bag. I don't wish to deplete yours. I've got stew from this morning. Needs heating is all." He moved toward the kitchen area, separated from the main room by a simple wooden counter. "Then I insist on helping," Margarette said firmly, following him. "I'm not one to sit idle while others work on my behalf." Mason gave her a sideways glance but nodded. There was something about her directness that he found oddly refreshing. Most folks in these parts either avoided him completely or approached with the nervous deference one might show a half-tamed wolf. As they worked side by side in the small kitchen, the storm outside intensified. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the desert landscape. Margarette glanced up at a particularly loud crash. "These storms can be fierce, but they pass quickly," Mason explained, stirring the pot of stew. "Come morning, you'd hardly know it happened, 'cept for the wildflowers that'll spring up after." "Nature's resilience is remarkable," Margarette agreed. "My father used to say that the harshest environments produce the most beautiful blooms." "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. The past tense hung between them, but Mason didn't press. Everyone had their ghosts out here. They ate at the small wooden table, the stew simple but hearty. Mason had also produced a loaf of surprisingly good bread. "Did you bake this?" Margarette asked, genuine surprise in her voice. "A man living alone learns to do for himself," Mason replied with a shrug, "or he eats poorly. A practical philosophy." She took another bite. "You mentioned having hands who could fetch the blacksmith tomorrow." Mason nodded. "2 brothers work the cattle for me. They have a cabin on the north side of the property. Good men. Keep to themselves mostly, which suits me fine." "And is that what suits you, Mr. Drake? Keeping to yourself?" The direct question caught him off guard. Most folks knew better than to pry. "It's Mason," he corrected again. "And yes, it does. Yet you came to my aid." Mason set down his spoon. "Don't read too much into it. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true." Her eyes held his steadily. "Especially not out here." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the persistent drumming of rain. "I'll make up the spare room for you," Mason finally said, rising from the table. "It's small but clean." "Thank you." She helped clear the dishes without being asked, working with efficient movements. "For everything." Mason merely nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude almost as much as with questions about his solitary existence. The spare room was indeed small, clearly used for storage more than guests. Mason quickly cleared away some crates and boxes, revealing a narrow bed with a simple wooden frame. "I'll get fresh linens," he said, disappearing down the hallway. Margarette stood in the center of the room, taking in the space. Unlike the main room with its bookshelves and sketches, This room held boxes labeled with dates. One had fallen open slightly, revealing what looked like children's toys, a small wooden horse and a child-sized hat. She quickly averted her eyes, respecting the privacy these boxed-up memories deserved. Mason returned with sheets and blankets. "It gets cold at night, even in spring," he explained, efficiently making up the bed. His hands, large and work-roughened, moved with surprising deftness at the domestic task. "You have a lovely home," Margarette said, choosing her words carefully. "It feels peaceful. Isolation has its benefits." Mason finished with the bed and straightened up. "Bathrooms down the hall. There's water heating on the stove if you want to wash up." "Thank you. I appreciate your hospitality more than I can express." Mason paused at the doorway. "It's just one night. Come morning, we'll get your wagon fixed and you'll be on your way to town. Best not get too comfortable." With that, he left her alone with her thoughts and the sound of rain against the small window. The storm continued through the night, and Margarette found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. The unfamiliar creaks of the house, combined with the knowledge that she was staying under the roof of a man she'd just met, a man who clearly preferred his solitude, kept her mind active. She had come to the New Mexico territory, seeking a fresh start, leaving behind the whispers and judging glances of her hometown in Pennsylvania. Teaching had always been her passion, and when the opportunity arose to take a position in the small frontier town of Steins Pass, it had seemed like providence. Now, stranded at the home of a reclusive rancher, she wondered if she'd been too hasty in her decision to come west. But then, hasty decisions had shaped much of her life. Some she regretted, others she cherished despite their consequences. Morning arrived with startling brightness, the storm having washed the desert air clean. Margarette dressed quickly in a simple blue cotton dress, braided her hair, and made her way to the main room. To her surprise, Mason was nowhere to be seen, but a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove, and a plate of biscuits was covered with a cloth on the table. She had just poured herself a cup of coffee when the front door opened and Mason entered, his clothes damp with morning dew and his boots muddy. "You're up early," he observed, removing his hat. "As are you," she replied. "I hope you don't mind that I helped myself to coffee." "That's why I left it." He removed his boots at the door before coming further into the house. "I've been to check on your wagon. The axle's worse than I thought. Sent Miguel one of my hands to town for the blacksmith, but it'll be a few days before it's repaired properly." Margarette set her cup down slowly. "A few days. Road to town's washed out in places from the storm, and once Miguel gets there, the blacksmith will need to come out, assess the damage, then go back for parts." Mason poured himself coffee. "Desert has its own timeline, Miss Holden." "Margarette, please," she sighed, considering her options. "I suppose I could walk to town." Mason let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's 15 miles, rough terrain, and the sun will bake you by midday, not to mention rattlesnakes, scorpions, and the occasional bandit." "I'm tougher than I look," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "No doubt, but it would still be foolish." He took a biscuit, breaking it open. "You can stay here until the wagon's fixed. I've got the space and it's no trouble." Margarette studied him. "Yesterday you seemed quite reluctant to have company, yet today you're offering extended hospitality. May I ask why?" Mason chewed slowly, buying time before answering. "I said I prefer being alone, didn't say I was inhumane." "There's a difference between humanity and hospitality, Mr. Drake." "Mason," he corrected for the third time, a hint of exasperation in his tone. "Mason," she acknowledged with a small nod. "And I appreciate the offer, truly, but I wouldn't want to impose. Perhaps there's somewhere in town I could stay." "Nearest boarding house is in town, which brings us back to the 15 miles of desert." He took a sip of his coffee. "Look, I understand your concern about staying with a stranger, but I give you my word you'll be safe here. I can have Maria Miguel's wife come up from their cabin if that would make you more comfortable." Margarette considered the offer. Her options were limited, and despite his gruff exterior, something about Mason Drake suggested trustworthiness. "That won't be necessary," she decided. "I'm a good judge of character, Mr. Mason, and I suspect you're a man of your word." He nodded once, accepting her decision without comment. "However," she continued, "I insist on earning my keep while I'm here. I notice your bookshelves need organizing, and I'm sure there are other tasks I could assist with." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of Mason's mouth. "Most ladies would offer to cook or clean." "I can do those as well, but I thought I'd start with something that clearly hasn't been attended to in some time." She gestured to the haphazard arrangement of books. "Besides, as a teacher, I have a natural inclination toward order among literature." "Fair enough," Mason conceded. "Though I warn you, my system may not make sense to anyone but me." All systems have their logic, even if it's not immediately apparent to others. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, Mason felt a flicker of something he'd long thought dormant curiosity about another human being. "I'll be working with the cattle most of the day," he said, finishing his coffee and standing. "Make yourself at home, but I'd advise against wandering too far. Desert's dangerous for those who don't know it." "I'll bear that in mind." She watched as he replaced his hat and moved toward the door. "Mason," he paused, looking back at her, "thank you. Again." He nodded once and was gone, leaving Margarette alone in the quiet house. The day passed slowly as Margarette busied herself with the bookshelves. Mason's collection was impressive and eclectic novels by Twain and Dickens alongside practical manuals on ranching, botany, and medicine. There were also several books on astronomy, with handwritten notes in the margins. As she worked, she couldn't help but wonder about the man who owned these books. He clearly wasn't the simple rancher he appeared at first glance. The careful annotations in the astronomy texts spoke of a methodical mind with a curiosity about the universe. Yet he had chosen this isolated existence, far from any intellectual community that might share his interests. By mid-afternoon, she had the books organized by subject, then alphabetically by author within each category. The task complete, she turned her attention to the kitchen, preparing a stew from the supplies she found there. It was the least she could do to repay his hospitality. The sun was beginning its descent when she heard hoofbeats approaching. From the kitchen window, she watched as Mason dismounted, spoke briefly with another man, presumably Miguel, and then headed toward the house. His shoulders looked weary, his movements slightly stiff after a long day's work. He paused when he entered, his eyes taking in the newly organized bookshelves. "You've been busy," he observed, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying dark hair. "It was a satisfying task," Margarette replied from the kitchen doorway. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of starting dinner as well." Mason sniffed the air appreciatively. "Smells good. Been a while since anyone cooked in this kitchen but me." Miguel brought news. "Blacksmith can come day after tomorrow. Roads still rough in places, but passable." He moved to the sink to wash up. "You should be on your way to town by week's end." "That's good news." She returned to stirring the stew, unsure why the prospect of leaving filled her with a vague disappointment. "I'm already late for the start of the school term." Towns waited this long for a teacher. Few more days won't matter. Mason dried his hands on a towel. "Your books gave me some insight." "Oh," she glanced up, curious. "You've read most of my collection already, the ones on education theory particularly. I noticed your own notes in some of them." Margarette felt a flush of embarrassment. I apologize for the presumption. No need, he cut her off. It's refreshing to see someone engage with ideas rather than just consume them. Your annotations were thoughtful. Coming from Mason, she suspected this was high praise indeed. Dinner was a quiet affair, but the silence felt more comfortable than the previous night. Afterward, Mason surprised her by retrieving a chessboard from a cabinet. Thought you might enjoy a game, he said, setting it up on the table. Unless you're tired. Not at all, Margarette replied, delighted. Though I should warn you, I was the champion of my college chess club. A genuine smile crossed Mason's face for the first time since she'd met him. Is that so? Well, I should warn you that I've had 20 years of practice against myself. I know all the best moves. Playing against oneself can lead to predictable strategies, Margarette countered, taking the seat opposite him. I look forward to providing some novel challenges. The game lasted well into the evening, both players evenly matched. As they played, conversation flowed more naturally. What brought you to teaching? Mason asked as he contemplated his next move. I've always loved learning, and sharing that with others seemed the natural path, she replied. My father was a professor of natural philosophy, so perhaps it's in my blood. And what brings you all the way to the New Mexico territory? Surely there were positions closer to home. Margarette was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. Sometimes a fresh start is necessary, she finally said. After my father passed, there was little keeping me in Pennsylvania. Mason nodded, understanding without pressing further. Your move, he said, indicating the board. 3 moves later, Margarette had him in checkmate. Mason stared at the board in disbelief before chuckling softly. Well played, Miss Holden. Margarette, she reminded him with a small smile, and thank you. It was a close game. Tomorrow night I demand a rematch, he said, beginning to pack away the pieces. I look forward to it. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Good night, Mason. Good night, Margarette. As she made her way to the spare room, Margarette found herself looking forward to another day in this unexpected sanctuary. For a man who valued his solitude, Mason Drake was proving to be surprisingly good company. The second day followed a similar pattern, though Mason returned earlier from his work, and they shared the task of preparing dinner. The conversation came more easily now, though both still carefully avoided certain topics for Mason, anything related to the 20 years he'd spent alone. For Margarette, the specific reasons that had prompted her journey west. Their chess game that evening was even more competitive, with Mason eventually claiming victory after nearly 3 hours of play. A worthy opponent, Margarette acknowledged as Mason captured her king. As are you, he replied, a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It's been refreshing to have someone to play with. Why did you stay out here alone for so long? The question slipped out before she could reconsider it, and she immediately regretted her boldness when she saw his expression shudder. I have my reasons, he said shortly, standing to clear the board. It's getting late. I apologize, Margarette said quietly. It wasn't my place to ask. Mason paused, his back to her. No, I'm the one who should apologize. You've been nothing but respectful of my privacy. He turned, his expression softer now. Some wounds take longer to heal than others. Let's leave it at that for now. She nodded, understanding all too well about wounds that resisted healing. The next morning brought Miguel with news that the blacksmith would arrive that afternoon. Margarette felt an unexpected pang at the thought that her time at Mason's ranch was coming to an end. While Mason worked with the cattle, Margarette decided to explore the immediate surroundings of the ranch house. The desert landscape was beautiful in its stark way, with distant mountains providing a dramatic backdrop. She found a small garden behind the house where herbs and a few vegetables grew in neat rows. She was kneeling to examine the plants when a rattling sound froze her in place. Slowly, she turned her head to see a rattlesnake coiled not 5 feet away, its warning clear. Margarette knew enough not to make any sudden movements, but fear locked her muscles in place. The snake's eyes seemed fixed on her, its rattle growing more insistent. "Don't move." Mason's voice came from somewhere behind her, calm and authoritative. She heard his careful footsteps approaching, then the soft thud of something landing near the snake. The rattling intensified briefly, then stopped. After a moment, Mason was beside her. "It's gone," he said, offering his hand to help her up. "Threw my hat to distract it. They don't want trouble any more than we do." Margarette took his hand, her own trembling slightly. "Thank you. I should have been more careful." "Desert's full of surprises," Mason said, retrieving his hat. He kept her hand in his a moment longer than necessary. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she assured him, though her heart was still racing. "Just a bit shaken." Mason's eyes were concerned as they searched her face. "Let's get you inside. Encounters like that can leave you light-headed afterward." His hand rested lightly on the small of her back as he guided her to the house, a gentlemanly gesture that nonetheless felt surprisingly intimate. Once inside, he poured her a glass of water, watching as she drank. "You're certain you're all right?" he asked again. "Yes, truly. Thanks to you." She set the glass down. "You seem to make a habit of rescuing me." A half-smile touched his lips. "Maybe you make a habit of needing rescue." "I assure you that's not typically the case," she replied with a small laugh. "I've managed quite well on my own for some time now." "As have I," Mason said, his eyes holding hers. "Until recently." The moment stretched between them, filled with something unspoken. Then the sound of approaching wagons broke the silence. "That'll be the blacksmith," Mason said, stepping back and clearing his throat. "I should go meet him." Margarette nodded, suddenly aware of how close they had been standing. "Of course." The blacksmith, a burly man named Hank Tillman, confirmed what Mason had already suspected: the wagon would need significant repairs. "Could take 3-4 days," Hank said, scratching his beard. "Need to forge a new axle. The old one split clean through." "I was afraid of that," Margarette sighed, looking at her damaged wagon. "You're welcome to stay until it's repaired," Mason said, his tone neutral but his eyes conveying sincerity. "I've already imposed on your hospitality too long," she protested. "It's no imposition," he assured her. "Besides, where else would you go?" She had no answer for that, and in truth, the prospect of a few more days at the ranch was not unwelcome. "Thank you," she said simply. "I accept." That evening, rather than chess, Mason surprised her by asking if she'd like to see the stars. "The skies are particularly clear tonight," he explained. "And I noticed you seemed interested in my astronomy books." "I'd love that," she replied, genuinely pleased by the suggestion. They sat on a bench outside the house, a respectable distance apart, as Mason pointed out constellations and planets. His knowledge was impressive, and his voice took on a different quality when he spoke of the stars, less guarded, more passionate. "How did you come to know so much about astronomy?" Margarette asked during a pause. Mason was quiet for a moment. "My wife," he finally said. "Sarah loved the stars, said they were windows into heaven." Margarette felt her breath catch. This was the first time he'd mentioned a wife. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. His profile in the starlight was stoic, but his voice carried a depth of emotion. "She and our son, James, died in a fever epidemic 20 years ago. I was away driving cattle to market. By the time I returned." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margarette's hand found his in the darkness, a gesture of simple compassion. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. "I'm so sorry, Mason." After that, I couldn't bear to be around people, their pity, their well-meaning words. So I came out here, built this place. Been here ever since. 20 years is a long time to be alone, she said softly. After a while, you stop noticing the loneliness, he replied. Or at least, you think you have. He turned to look at her, his expression difficult to read in the dim light, until something reminds you. The air between them felt charged with unspoken possibilities. Margarette was acutely aware of his hand still holding hers, of the quiet night surrounding them, of the vast desert stretching into darkness beyond the circle of light from the house. I should turn in, she said finally, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. It's been a long day. Mason nodded, standing when she did. Of course. Good night, Margarette. Good night, Mason. She felt his eyes on her as she walked back to the house and fought the urge to look back. The next few days established a comfortable routine. During the day, Mason attended to his ranch work while Margarette helped around the house, or assisted with simple tasks like gathering eggs from the small henhouse or harvesting vegetables from the garden. In the evenings, they shared meals, played chess, and talked under the stars. Mason gradually revealed more of his past, his childhood in Colorado, his early years as a cattle driver, meeting Sarah when he delivered a herd to her father's ranch. In turn, Margarette shared stories of her life in Pennsylvania, her years at a women's college, her work as a teacher in a small town school. What she didn't share was the scandal that had forced her to leave a false accusation of impropriety with a male colleague that, while eventually disproven, had nonetheless tarnished her reputation beyond repair in the small, gossiping community. Some stains, she had learned, could never be fully washed away, no matter how baseless. On the fourth day, Hank Tillman returned with the repaired wagon. Good as new, he declared proudly, demonstrating the sturdy new axle. You could drive this to California if you had a mind to. Thank you, Margarette said, paying him from her carefully budgeted funds. I appreciate your swift work. So I suppose you'll be heading to town tomorrow, Mason said once Hank had departed. His tone was casual, but Margarette detected something underneath it, regret, perhaps. I suppose I should, she agreed, feeling strangely reluctant. I'm already late for the start of the school term. Mason nodded, his expression unreadable. I'll ride with you. Some parts of the trail can be tricky if you don't know them. That's very kind. Margarette hesitated, then added, I can't thank you enough for your hospitality, Mason. These days have been unexpected, but I'm grateful for them. As am I, he replied simply. That night, their chess game seemed particularly intense, each move carefully considered as if they were playing for higher stakes than usual. When Margarette finally claimed victory, Mason conceded with grace. You've improved my game considerably, he said, leaning back in his chair. I'll miss our matches. Perhaps I could visit sometime, Margarette suggested before she could reconsider the boldness of such an offer. Or you could come to town occasionally. Mason's expression closed slightly. I don't go to town much. Of course, she said quickly. I didn't mean to presume. It's not that I wouldn't want to see you, Mason clarified, his eyes meeting hers directly. It's just, I've built my life a certain way. Change doesn't come easy after so long. I understand, Margarette assured him, though a small part of her was disappointed. They prepared for departure early the next morning. Margarette's few belongings were quickly packed and loaded onto the wagon. Mason saddled Copper, planning to ride alongside her to town. As they were about to leave, a rider approached at speed, Miguel, looking concerned. Senor Drake, he called, reining in his horse. There is trouble with the north herd. The creek has flooded and they are stranded on the high ground. Some are injured. Mason's expression turned grave. How many? At least a dozen, maybe more. Pablo is with them now, but he cannot move them alone. Mason turned to Margarette, conflict evident in his eyes. I'm sorry, but I need to go, she interrupted. Of course you must. I can find my way to town. It's not that simple, he said, frowning. The main trail is likely flooded too if the creek is running high. You'd have to take the high trail, which isn't marked well. Margarette squared her shoulders. Then draw me a map. I'm not helpless, Mason. I can follow directions. He looked at her for a long moment, clearly torn between his responsibility to his cattle and his concern for her safety. Wait here, he finally said, heading into the house. He returned a few minutes later with a hastily drawn map. Follow this exactly, he instructed, handing it to her. The high trail is rocky but safe from flooding. When you reach this junction, he pointed to a mark on the map, take the right fork, not the left. The left leads to an old mining camp. It's abandoned now, but sometimes drifters camp there. Right fork, not left, Margarette repeated, studying the map. I understand. Mason still looked troubled. I don't like sending you alone. I'll be fine, she assured him with more confidence than she felt. Your livelihood is at stake. Go. After another moment's hesitation, Mason nodded. Be careful. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. I will, she promised. And thank you again for everything. His eyes held hers, and for a brief moment she thought he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded, mounted Copper, and rode off with Miguel toward the endangered herd. Margarette watched until they disappeared from view, then turned her attention to the map. The route seemed straightforward enough, though she'd need to be vigilant for the landmarks Mason had indicated. Taking a deep breath, she climbed onto the wagon seat and set off. The first few hours of the journey passed without incident. The high trail was indeed rocky, but the newly repaired wagon handled the terrain well. She marveled at the stark beauty of the landscape, the red rock formations, the occasional splash of desert wildflowers, the vast blue sky overhead. By midday, the sun was relentless, and Margarette was grateful for the wide-brimmed hat and water supplies Mason had insisted she take. She paused in the shade of a large rock formation to rest the horses and consult the map. According to Mason's drawings, she should be approaching the junction soon. She squinted ahead, trying to make out the landmarks he described, a distinctive split rock that looked like a pair of horns, followed by a dry wash that would lead to the fork in the trail. Resuming her journey, she spotted the horn-shaped rock in the distance and felt a surge of relief. She was on the right path after all. The dry wash came next, and she guided the horses carefully down its gentle slope. At the bottom, she paused, confused. Instead of a clear fork in the trail, she saw 3 possible paths branching out. Mason's map had only indicated 2. She studied the map again, trying to match the drawing to the reality before her. The sun had shifted, casting different shadows than when Mason had likely last traveled this route, making it difficult to identify which path was which. After several minutes of deliberation, she chose the path that seemed to bend to the right, recalling Mason's warning to take the right fork. As she traveled, however, a sense of unease began to grow. The trail was becoming less defined, and the surrounding terrain didn't match what she'd expected based on the map. After another hour, she was forced to admit she'd made a wrong turn somewhere. Just as she was considering turning back, she spotted structures in the distance, buildings of some kind. Hope surged through her. Perhaps she'd accidentally found a different route to Steins Pass. As she drew closer, however, her hope faded. This was clearly the abandoned mining camp Mason had warned her about. Dilapidated wooden structures leaned at precarious angles, and rusted mining equipment lay scattered about. The place had an air of desolation that made her shiver despite the heat. She was about to turn the wagon around when movement caught her eye. Men, three of them, emerged from one of the buildings, alerted by the sound of her approach. They were rough-looking, unshaven, with clothes that had seen better days, drifters, just as Mason had warned. Margarette's heart began to race as the men approached her wagon, their expressions a mixture of surprise and something more predatory. "Well, well," the tallest of the three said, reaching for the bridle of her lead horse. "What brings a fine lady like yourself to our humble camp?" "I've taken a wrong turn," Margarette replied, keeping her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm trying to reach Steins Pass." The man grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "That's so. Well, you're a fair piece off course, madam. Steins Pass is a good day's ride from here." "Then I should be on my way," she said firmly, gathering the reins. "If you could just point me in the right direction." "Now, hold on," another man said, moving to the other side of the wagon. "Ain't often we get visitors, especially ones so pretty. Why not stay a spell? We got food, whiskey." "No, thank you," Margarette said, a tremor now evident in her voice despite her efforts. "I really must continue my journey." The first man's hand moved to rest on his gun belt. "I don't think you understand, madam. We wasn't exactly asking." Terror coursed through Margarette as she realized the danger she was in. These men had likely been away from civilization for some time, and a lone woman would be seen as easy prey. She glanced around desperately, looking for any means of escape. "The lady said she's leaving." The new voice, deep and commanding, came from behind the miners. All heads turned to see Mason astride Copper, his rifle aimed steadily at the tall miner. "This ain't your concern, mister," the miner growled, though his hand had frozen on his gun belt. "The lady is under my protection," Mason replied, his voice cold as steel. "So yes, it is my concern." A tense silence followed as the miners assessed their odds. 3 against 1, but Mason's rifle gave him a distinct advantage, as did his calm, deadly serious demeanor. "We was just offering directions," the second miner finally said, stepping back from the wagon. "No harm intended." "Then step away and let her pass," Mason ordered, not lowering his rifle. The miners exchanged glances, then reluctantly moved aside. Margarette didn't wait for further invitation, snapping the reins to get the horses moving. Mason backed Copper up, keeping his rifle trained on the miners until she had passed, then turned to follow her. They rode in silence until the mining camp was well behind them. Only then did Mason move Copper alongside the wagon. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now, though concern was etched in every line of his face. "Yes," Margarette said, though her hands were still shaking on the reins. "How did you find me?" "When we got to the herd, the situation wasn't as bad as Miguel had thought. I sent him and Pablo to handle it and doubled back to escort you." His expression darkened. "Good thing I did." "Yes," she agreed fervently. "Those men, they would have." "Don't think about it," Mason said firmly. "It's over now." They continued on, Mason now leading the way along the correct trail. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. "We won't reach town before nightfall," Mason observed after a while. "There's a sheltered spot about an hour ahead where we can make camp. It's defensible, with good water nearby." Margarette nodded, exhaustion beginning to set in now that the immediate danger had passed. "Whatever you think best." The campsite Mason led them to was indeed well chosen, a natural alcove formed by rock formations, with a small spring providing fresh water. Mason efficiently set up camp, building a small fire and preparing a simple meal from supplies he'd brought in his saddlebags. As they sat by the fire, eating in companionable silence, Margarette finally spoke. "Thank you, Mason, not just for today, but for everything." He nodded, his eyes on the fire. "I should have escorted you from the beginning. It was foolish to let you go alone." You had responsibilities to your ranch, she reminded him, and I insisted I could manage. Still, he said, looking up at her now, I shouldn't have risked your safety. There was something in his gaze that made her heart beat faster. Why did you really come after me, Mason? The herd couldn't have been secured that quickly. Mason set his plate aside, considering his answer. When I rode away this morning, something didn't sit right. I kept thinking about you traveling alone, about all the things that could go wrong. He paused. I realized I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. The admission hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. In 20 years, he continued, his voice lower now, I haven't let myself care about anyone. It was easier that way, safer. His eyes held hers across the fire. And then you broke down on my land, and in less than a week, you've made me remember what it's like to not want to be alone. Margarette's throat tightened with emotion. Mason. You don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I know you're heading to town to your new life. I just wanted you to know that you've changed something in me, whether or not anything comes of it. Margarette rose and moved to sit beside him. These past days have meant a great deal to me as well, she said softly. More than I expected. But you're still leaving, he stated rather than asked, his eyes searching hers. I made a commitment to the school in Steins Pass, she reminded him gently. And you've built your life around solitude. 1 week doesn't change 20 years. Mason looked away, back into the flames. You're right, of course. I shouldn't have presumed. That's not what I meant, Margarette said, placing her hand on his arm. I just mean that we both have lives that were set in motion long before we met. Changing course requires more than a moment's decision. He covered her hand with his own. What if I asked you not to go, to stay at the ranch? The question caught her off guard. Mason, you'd regret staying, he finished for her, a sad smile touching his lips. I understand. It was selfish of me to ask. I never do, she said softly. He looked at her, confusion in his eyes. Never do what? Regret my decisions once made. She met his gaze steadily. If I were to stay, it would be because I chose to, not because you asked, and I wouldn't regret it. Hope flickered in Mason's eyes, but was quickly tempered with caution. You've only known me a week. You haven't seen the worst of me, the darkness, the moodiness, the years of habits formed in solitude. And you haven't seen my stubbornness, my occasional sharp tongue, or my tendency to rearrange other people's belongings, she countered with a small smile. We all have our flaws, Mason. It wouldn't be easy, he warned. The ranch is isolated, the work is hard, and I'm not used to considering another person in my decisions. The best things rarely come easily. She paused, considering her next words carefully. I'm not saying yes or no right now. I still need to go to town to speak with the school board. I made a commitment and I won't break it without proper notice. But perhaps we could explore what might be possible given time. Mason's hand tightened on hers. I can accept that. They sat in silence as the fire burned lower, the stars emerging in full brilliance overhead. The desert night was cool, and Mason eventually put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, feeling a sense of rightness that defied their short acquaintance. Tell me about your son, she said softly. James. Mason tensed slightly, then relaxed. He was 5 when I lost him, full of energy, always running, exploring, had his mother's eyes and her curiosity about everything. His voice was tinged with old grief, but there was warmth too. He wanted to be a cattle driver like his pa, used to practice with a little rope Sarah made him. He sounds wonderful, Margarette said, her head resting against Mason's shoulder. He was. Mason's arm tightened around her. For a long time it hurt too much to remember, but now it feels right to speak of him. Sometimes sharing memories keeps them alive in a different way, she offered. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts without reservation now. When the fire had burned down to embers, Mason spread his bedroll for Margarette while he took first watch, insisting on caution despite their apparent safety. "I'll wake you in a few hours to trade," she insisted, knowing he needed rest too. He agreed, though reluctantly, and Margarette settled into the bedroll, watching as Mason took up a position near the entrance to their rock alcove, rifle across his lap. There was something deeply comforting about his vigilant presence, something that made her feel secure in a way she hadn't in years. As she drifted toward sleep, she thought about the choice that lay ahead. The teaching position in Steins Pass had represented a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her reputation and practice the profession she loved. But Mason's ranch offered a different kind of new beginning, one with its own challenges, certainly, but also with the possibility of a connection she hadn't expected to find. Morning came with the soft glow of dawn spreading across the desert. Margarette woke to find Mason already up, tending a small fire where coffee was brewing. "You didn't wake me for my watch," she accused gently, sitting up. "You were sleeping peacefully," he replied with a slight shrug. "Seemed ashamed to disturb you." They broke camp efficiently and were on the trail as the sun rose fully. The route to Steins Pass was clearer now, with Mason leading the way. They reached the outskirts of town by mid-morning. Steins Pass was larger than Margarette had expected, though still small by Eastern standards. A main street lined with wooden buildings formed the heart of the settlement, with houses and smaller establishments spreading outward. The school was a modest but well-maintained building near the center of town. As they approached, Margarette felt a mixture of emotions: anticipation about her new position, anxiety about explaining her delayed arrival, and underlying it all, uncertainty about what her future might hold. Mason guided them to the small hotel across from the schoolhouse. "You can get settled here while you meet with the school board," he said as he helped her down from the wagon. "How long will you stay in town?" she asked, suddenly afraid he might leave immediately. "A day or two," he replied. "Got some supplies to pick up, and—" He hesitated, then continued, "Thought you might need time to consider your options." Margarette nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Will you come back tomorrow? Perhaps we could have dinner and I could tell you how my meeting with the school board goes." "I'd like that," Mason agreed, a hint of a smile touching his lips. The hotel was simple but clean, and Margarette was shown to a small room on the second floor. After freshening up, she made her way to the school building, where she found the caretaker who directed her to the home of Mr. Simmons, the head of the school board. Clarence Simmons was a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and a perpetually worried expression. He seemed simultaneously relieved to see Margarette and concerned about her delayed arrival. "We were beginning to think you weren't coming, Miss Holden," he said after inviting her into his parlor. "School should have started last week." "I apologize for the delay, Mr. Simmons," Margarette replied. "My wagon broke down outside of town and repairs took several days." "Well, no matter. You're here now and we can begin classes immediately." He shuffled through some papers on his desk. "We have 23 students enrolled, ages 6 to 16. The curriculum is basic reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. Nothing too fancy, mind you. Our children need practical education." Margarette nodded, though inwardly she hoped to expand the curriculum eventually. "I understand. When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow, if possible," Mr. Simmons said eagerly. "I'll have notices sent to all the families today." "Tomorrow," Margarette repeated, feeling strangely distant from the conversation. This was what she had come for, what she had planned and prepared for. Yet now, Faced with the reality, she found herself thinking of a quiet ranch house and a man who had spent 20 years alone. "Is that acceptable, Miss Holden?" Mr. Simmons asked, noting her hesitation. "Yes, of course," she assured him quickly. "I'm just organizing my thoughts. There's much to prepare." Mr. Simmons showed her the schoolhouse next, explaining the resources available and the expectations of the community. The building was well constructed, with plenty of natural light and enough desks for all the students. A small apartment attached to the rear of the schoolhouse would serve as her living quarters. "It's modest, but comfortable," Mr. Simmons explained as he showed her the two-room apartment. "Previous teachers have found it quite adequate." "It's lovely," Margarette said, though she couldn't help comparing it to Mason's ranch house with its bookshelves and chess set in view of the stars. After completing the tour, Margarette returned to the hotel, her mind whirling with conflicting thoughts. The teaching position was exactly what she had hoped for, a chance to use her education and skills to shape young minds in a community that valued learning. The apartment, while small, would provide independence and respectability. Yet the thought of Mason returning to his ranch alone, of never again sharing conversations by firelight or chess matches that stretched into the night, filled her with a profound sadness. She spent the afternoon preparing lesson plans, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand rather than the decision that loomed before her. By evening, she had organized her first week of classes and was feeling more settled in her professional role, if not in her personal dilemma. As promised, Mason came to the hotel the next evening to share dinner. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his usually sun-bleached hair dampened and combed, his clothes less dusty than usual. The effort touched her deeply. "How was your meeting with the school board?" he asked once they were seated in the hotel's small dining room. "Productive," Margarette replied. "Classes begin tomorrow. 23 students of varying ages and abilities." "They're lucky to have you," Mason said sincerely. "Those children will learn more than just their letters and numbers, I expect." "That's kind of you to say." She hesitated, then added, "The school board has provided living quarters attached to the schoolhouse. Small but adequate." Mason's eyes flickered with something disappointment, perhaps, but he nodded. "Convenient for your work." "Yes," she agreed, "and proper for a teacher to live on school grounds." They ate in silence for a few moments, the unspoken question hanging between them. "Have you decided then?" Mason finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. Margarette met his gaze. "I've been thinking about what you said about 20 years of solitude not changing in a week, and you're right. Change takes time." She took a deep breath. "Which is why I've decided to fulfill my commitment to the school, at least for now." Mason nodded slowly, his expression guarded. "I understand. But," she continued, reaching across the table to take his hand, "I was hoping you might consider visiting town occasionally, perhaps Sunday dinners. And maybe in time, if we find that we suit each other as well as we think we might." Hope flickered in Mason's eyes. "You'd consider coming to the ranch eventually." "I would," she confirmed. "Or perhaps we might find a middle ground, a place not so isolated but close enough to town for me to continue teaching." Mason was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I've lived a certain way for so long," he said slowly. "The thought of change is daunting. But the thought of returning to complete solitude after knowing you—" he squeezed her hand, "that's more daunting still." "So we'll take it slowly," Margarette suggested. "Get to know each other better, see where time leads us." A genuine smile spread across Mason's face, transforming his weathered features. "I believe I can agree to those terms, Miss Holden." "I'm very glad to hear it, Mr. Drake," she replied, returning his smile. The next morning, Margarette stood before her class for the first time, 23 curious faces watching her with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. As she introduced herself and began outlining her expectations for their studies, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her calling, her skill, her contribution to the world. Yet when she returned to her small apartment that evening, she found a package waiting on her doorstep. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden chest set with a note, "For when I come to town," or "For when you visit the ranch. Either way, I expect a rematch." Mason, she smiled, running her fingers over the intricately carved pieces. Perhaps, she thought, it was possible to honor both her vocation and the unexpected connection she'd found with a man who had spent 20 years learning to live alone. Over the following weeks, Mason kept his word, riding into town each Sunday to share dinner with Margarette. Sometimes they ate at the hotel, but more often in her small apartment, where Margarette would prepare meals that reminded Mason of home cooking he hadn't experienced in decades. Their chess matches continued, each winning and losing in fairly equal measure. More importantly, their conversations deepened, exploring topics from literature to politics, from childhood memories to hopes for the future. Margarette thrived in her role as teacher, introducing her students to ideas and books beyond the basic curriculum. The parents, initially skeptical of her Eastern education and refined manner, grew to appreciate her dedication and the progress their children made under her guidance. Mason, too, was changing. His monthly trips to town for supplies became weekly visits. He began to know the townspeople by name, to exchange greetings with merchants and ranchers he had previously avoided. The hard shell of isolation that had protected him for 20 years was slowly, incrementally softening. 3 months after Margarette's arrival in Steins Pass, Mason attended the school's Harvest Festival, his first community event in 2 decades. He stood awkwardly at first, uncomfortable with the crowds and noise, but relaxed when Margarette's students approached him, curious about the quiet rancher who had captured their teacher's attention. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Mason found himself telling the children about raising cattle, about reading the weather from cloud patterns, about navigating by stars. His natural gift for explanation, long dormant, resurfaced as the children listened with rapt attention. "You're quite the teacher yourself," Margarette observed later as they walked back to her apartment. Mason shook his head, though he was smiling. "Just passing on practical knowledge. Isn't that what teaching is?" she countered. "Sharing what we know with those who need to learn it." He considered this, then nodded. "I suppose so. Still, it's different from what you do, more structured, more important. Different, yes, not more important." She took his hand as they walked, a gesture that no longer raised eyebrows in town. Knowledge comes in many forms. The children need all of them to thrive. As winter approached, Margarette accepted Mason's invitation to spend Christmas at the ranch. The school's 2-week holiday provided the perfect opportunity for an extended visit, allowing her to experience ranch life beyond the brief glimpses she'd had during her accidental stay. Mason had prepared carefully for her visit, enlisting Maria's help to make the house more welcoming. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and bundles of dried desert flowers added color to the rooms. Most touching to Margarette was the small Christmas tree set up in the corner of the main room, decorated with simple ornaments Mason had carved himself. "It's beautiful," she said when she first saw it, her eyes bright with emotion. "Haven't had a Christmas tree in 20 years, Mason admitted. "Figured it was time." The holiday passed with a quiet joy neither had experienced in years. They exchanged simple gifts, a new leather journal for Margarette, a finely woven scarf for Mason. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire, and Mason surprised her by pulling out a small wooden box from behind his chair. "This was Sarah's," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a small star pendant. "She wore it every day. After she died, I put it away. Couldn't bear to look at it." He met Margarette's eyes. "I'd like you to have it." Margarette's breath caught. "Mason, I couldn't possibly, please," he said softly. "Sarah would have liked you. She would have wanted it to be worn, not hidden away in a box." With tears in her eyes, Margarette accepted the gift, understanding the profound significance of the gesture. It wasn't just a necklace he was offering, but a place in his heart alongside, not replacing, the memory of his first love. "I'll treasure it," she promised as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin gently. When Mason kissed her for the first time that night, it felt like the natural conclusion to a journey that had begun with a broken wagon and an unexpected act of kindness. The winter months brought challenges: heavy snow isolating the ranch at times, illness sweeping through the school that left Margarette exhausted from caring for sick children, cattle lost to wolves during a particularly bitter cold snap. Through it all, their connection deepened, tested by difficulties and strengthened by shared resilience. By spring, they had fallen into a rhythm: weekdays apart as Margarette taught and Mason tended his ranch, weekends together either in town or at the ranch, depending on Mason's work and Margarette's obligations. It was on a warm April evening, with wildflowers blooming across the desert just as Mason had once predicted, that he asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson. "I know it's not the life you planned," he said, holding a simple gold band between his fingers. "The ranch is isolated, the work is hard, and I'm still learning how to share my life after so many years alone." "It's better than any life I planned," Margarette replied, her voice steady with conviction, "because it's real and it's ours." "Is that a yes?" Mason asked, hope clear in his eyes. "Yes," she said simply. 1,000 times yes." They were married in June, in a small ceremony at the ranch with the townsfolk of Steins Pass in attendance. Mr. Simmons reluctantly accepted Margarette's resignation from her teaching position, though she promised to help find and train her replacement. "You could continue teaching," Mason had offered when she first broached the subject of resigning. "We could find a way to make it work." But Margarette had shaken her head. "There are other ways to teach," she'd replied. "I'm thinking of starting a small school here at the ranch for the children of the nearby homesteads who can't make it to town regularly. Just a few days a week, enough to give them the basics. And perhaps expand your library to serve as a lending library for those who can't afford books of their own." Mason had smiled at her enthusiasm. "Building a community in the middle of nowhere. Building our community," she'd corrected. "And it's not nowhere. It's home." Their first year of marriage brought adjustments for both, Mason learning to consult another person in decisions he'd made alone for decades, Margarette adapting to the rhythms and demands of ranch life. There were arguments, compromises, moments of frustration, and moments of profound connection. The small school Margarette established grew steadily, with children from 3 neighboring ranches attending lessons twice a week. Mason found himself teaching alongside her, sharing his knowledge of the land, the animals, the stars. His initial awkwardness with the children gave way to a natural mentorship that surprised everyone except Margarette, who had always seen the teacher within him. In their second year of marriage, Margarette gave birth to a son they named Thomas James Drake, honoring both her father and Mason's lost son. The baby brought a new dimension to their lives, filling the ranch house with laughter and reminding Mason of joys he'd thought forever lost to him. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler to spirited young boy, the ranch transformed as well. Additional rooms were added to accommodate both the growing family and the expanding school. The garden doubled in size, now producing vegetables not just for their household but for neighboring families as well. The library became a gathering place on Sunday afternoons, where ranchers and their families would come to borrow books and share news. On Thomas's 5th birthday, as they watched him racing around the yard with the children of neighbors who had once been strangers, Margarette slipped her hand into Mason's. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing a question from years before. "I never do," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. Mason's arm tightened around her waist. 20 years alone taught me to survive," he said quietly. "But you taught me to live again." The setting sun cast long shadows across the ranch that had once been a place of solitude and was now the heart of a small but vibrant community. As they stood together watching their son play, both knew with absolute certainty that some broken wagons lead exactly where one is meant to go.